Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. In this lesson, we'll review how to build a strategy for a project and how the IPO FAT tool can be used for developing that strategy. The only prerequisite for this particular lesson is the Introduction to Lean and Six Sigma, which discusses the IPO model. Be sure to check out that first if you haven't already done so. We'll begin this lesson by exploring what it means to have a project strategy.
Well, having a project strategy basically means that you're building some sort of plan of attack for how you're going to execute the next few steps of the project to resolve the problem for the project. Now, the DMAIC methodology itself, that's part of Six Sigma, is a general guideline that should influence how we attack the project. But the strategy is a little bit more specific in the sense that it identifies the next immediate few steps in your process for how you'll specifically and logically attack the problem that you're trying to resolve in the project. Let me give you a couple examples of ones that I had worked in the past when I was trying to support a call center. So in the first example, we're looking at what we call like a repeat caller alert analysis, some metric called a repeat caller alert. So the problem associated there was a call center that uses this repeat caller alert in the system as a way to detect when a customer who's calling in to see whether that customer had actually called in before. And if they can see if the customer had recently called in before, can that rep or the agent who's on the phone know if they're calling ahead of time and help prevent the recurring issue, because they want to stop that caller from calling back again if they can resolve the issue correctly up front the first time. So they want to know, does this alert that's in the system help improve the issue resolution, which is a metric that basically is a way for us to understand, have we resolved the customer's issue? So is this alert, by making the rep or the agent aware of the customer being a repeat caller or potential repeat caller, is that going to help them improve the issue resolution metric? Well, the strategy that we defined was that we needed to first acquire as much of the customer satisfaction survey data as possible, and that's the data that's associated with the issue resolution itself. And we built out a plan in 3 steps basically for how we're going to ask the questions that lead us down the path for resolving the issue. So the first question was, how often is the RCA, that indicator, how often is that even on? In other words, how often is it really indicating to us that it suspects the customer is potentially a repeat call customer? Next, we wanted to ask, is that indicator, the RCA metric, is that effective at finding repeat calls? So in other words, did the customer survey actually confirm that it's a repeat call? Next, the last question was, is the RCA process effective at improving IR as expected for these verified repeat calls? So first we want to understand overall here, how often is it even occurring? And then we want to find out how often is it even accurate when it does turn on and suggests that it could be a repeat call. How accurate is it at actually identifying whether it truly is a repeat call or not? And when it is a repeat call, when it does come on, and how effective is it at actually improving the overall issue resolution metric that we're trying to improve? So by asking those 3 basic questions, we're aligning for ourselves the strategy for how we're going to resolve the overall problem that we're trying to solve. The next example is one again with the call center, and the metric here is, let's say it's a repeat contact prevention or RCP type of metric. So the problem here that we're trying to solve is we want that metric for the call center. We want to improve it because we're seeing that it's 10 percentage points lower than the enterprise RCP metric. That is the metric that represents all call centers everywhere, not just this one particular call center. And they're wondering, why is this one particular call center 10 points lower than all the other ones? And they want to make some improvement. So here's an outline of the strategy that was defined. Basically, it was illustrated as an equation in order for us to help explain and understand what are the factors or things that could be influencing this performance gap that we're seeing in the RCP metric itself. So we said basically, starting with as an equation, RCP gap, this is what we're trying to solve for. So hypothetically, we might say this call center was at about 50%, where the enterprise was represented at about 60%. So there's the 10% gap maybe that we're seeing. So we want to first understand what's causing this gap. What are the factors that could be influencing this gap? So that gap, we say, is equal to 3 potential factors. Those 3 factors are, first, the process steps. That is, are there steps in our process for how our reps actually execute the steps in order to resolve the person's issue who's calling in? Are those steps in the process not preventing the repeat call? Those are the things that are in our control. Next, for the process execution, we basically said, is maybe the process is okay, but maybe it's the rep themselves who are not doing an adequate job at following the steps, and by not following the steps, then again, they're not actually helping to prevent that repeat call. Again, that's something within our control because the agents or reps are the ones that are on the phone trying to follow the process that we define for them. And then third, the customer caused. That is, maybe we can have the best process in the world, maybe our reps are doing a great job of following the process, but maybe the customer is doing something that is outside of our control that is requiring this particular repeat call. So again, illustrating it this way, it helped us explain how we're going to attack this issue because we outlined it as this is our strategy for how we're going to try to resolve this original problem.
An effective way to build a project strategy is to use an IPO FAT tool. So let's talk about what that is and how you can use it.
Well, the IPO FAT tool is basically a method for looking at or evaluating a business area to see what potential opportunities there could be in that area. Now, it's a little bit different than the QFD that we had looked at in the previous training lesson, which generally prioritizes existing known opportunities. This IPO FAT tool instead is a way for us to identify maybe new or different opportunities that we haven't even considered before. So when is it that we would use an IPO FAT tool? Well, it's most effective, I believe, when a business area has several problems with potentially interrelated root causes. It's something that's not immediately known, at least the priority of how you might attack the different problems. Very often I'll use this when an organization comes and says, we're just not meeting a bunch of our metrics. We have so many opportunities for failure here. We're not really sure what we need to focus on first, what order we need to look at them, or what all the potential opportunities are. So basically, in an area where you don't know what you don't know, this could be a great tool to help guide you into finding all the potential opportunities and again giving you suggestion for how you might prioritize those. So it could be a very effective method as well for how you might build and communicate the project strategy like we had just previously discussed. So the premise behind the actual IPO FAT tool is built on, first of all, the input, process, and output for everything that usually is associated within the business. That is, everything can go back to the IPO and input that goes through a process and creates some sort of output, similar to the meat grinder example that we've used in the past. Well, the FAT portion of this basically breaks down looking at that IPO across three different perspectives. First of all, there's the flow perspective. That is, it's looking at how things flow through the process itself, how items pass, how the inputs become inputs, and how they flow through the process. Next, it looks into accuracy perspective. It's looking at the effectiveness of each of those stages, the effectiveness of the inputs coming in, the quality of those inputs coming in, as well as the quality of the process itself and what's coming out of the process. And then finally, it's like looking at the perspective from a timeliness side. That is, looking at the efficiency of how the inputs are coming into the process, the efficiency of the process itself in creating those outputs. So you think of it in terms of like glasses. You're putting on three different sets of glasses, and each of those looking at the input, process, and output from those different perspectives. So the IPO FAT tool also identifies the priority or potential suggested priority for when you identify these opportunities, how you might order those. And it also has a suggestion for what type of methodology you might use, whether it's lean sets of tools or Six Sigma sets of tools or methods, or maybe a combination of both. Alright, so now let's look at the IPO FAT tool and how it's basically laid out. Basically, it looks like this matrix, where it's a 3x3 basic matrix with 9 blocks in there. And looking at this, you basically start with the input that leads into a process that creates some sort of output. That's the IPO portion. And then we're going to be looking at all the things that are inputs leading into a process that create the output from, again, the three perspectives. First, a flow perspective, down and underneath of that, the accuracy perspective, and then finally a timeliness perspective. So let's fill in each of these different blocks in here so you can see how these different perspectives are applied when we look at the IPO. So first we start off with this first box, the incoming volume. It's basically asking what are the opportunities of reducing the incoming volume from the prior output. That is, what is an input into this particular process? This input was an output from some other process before it. So what are those things that are coming in that maybe we shouldn't be getting at all? If we can make sure that we're getting only the right stuff flowing into us, and not getting stuff that isn't intended for us, then we'll be doing ourselves a whole lot of good. That way we're ensuring that we're only looking at the things or working on the things that are most critical. A typical example could be it's easier sometimes when somebody is responsible for working on certain transactions. If there are certain transactions that are passed on to them that are not intended for them, they might think, well, it's easier for them to just go ahead and perform whatever work they normally do in the transaction than to raise up some concerns about why they're getting these transactions in the first place. So they'll spend time actually doing it even though maybe it wasn't intended to go to them in the first place. So this is basically saying what are those things that are the incoming volume that maybe we should not be getting. Next, the opportunity is to look at the workflow rhythm. That is, how can the throughput, usually measured like takt time, how can that be optimized by looking at different FIFO, which is a first in, first out, or maybe batch processing or schedule balancing. Think of this in terms of like we want to balance our flow of the work with the availability of the resources to perform the work. So for example, if you happen to have transactions or things that are worked throughout every day of the week, but maybe you have higher volume on certain days and lower volume on different days. Well, if it seems to be pretty typical and expected, then you obviously would want to accommodate your resources to where the biggest flow of the volume is, to the least flow as well. So if you have more volume on certain days, then you probably want to put more of your resources on those days, less resources on the days where you have less volume flowing in. By doing that, then you're helping to eliminate potential delays and problems because you're getting the resources in balance with the flow and the rhythm of the work that's processed. Next, from the accuracy perspective, the thing we might look at is the quality or the value add. It's basically asking what are the process steps that we own that aren't really adding any value, or maybe they're not required or they don't meet any specific policy or specifications. So are there things that we own in our process that perhaps we can eliminate? Next that we might look at from the accuracy perspective is what I call readiness. That is, how complete or accurate are the inputs before they're actually coming to us. So we might be getting things as transactions passed on to us that are things that are incomplete. They're missing some critical information. Well, if we can ensure that information is complete and everything is provided that we need to perform our jobs, it's as ready as possible, then we're able to probably keep it more accurate and ensure that the quality of what we're working in the process is going to be good. Next thing to look at is from the timeliness perspective, that is the arrival or setup time. That is, we might ask ourselves how much delay is there between the prior output, again as an input, this is actually as an input is an output from some prior process before it. So how much delay is there between when it was an output from the prior process to being the current input now? And how much setup or lead time is required before we can get it into the process itself? By identifying those things, that might be a way for us to speed up the actual timeliness involved for whatever it is we're producing. And then the last one to look at on here is handle time. That is, what is the amount of time that's being spent for the actual value-added steps that we have in the process. Now these are the 6 basic steps, and we have a certain order in here that I'll get into in just a second. But these are the 6 basic things that we would want to suggest that we look at when we're looking at it from an IPO FAT perspective. Now, the output portion is obviously not identified in here, but the things over here for the output is how you might basically measure the output from these 3 different perspectives. So for example, for the flow perspective, that flow might be measured through like the production rate or rolled throughput yield. These are again things that are identified in another training video. From the accuracy perspective, we might measure that in terms of the percent of defects or percent effective, or DPMO, So basically asking what is the rate of the defects, or maybe the scraps, or a first time yield. Those kinds of things might be the way that we measure from that accuracy perspective. Finally, we might measure the timeliness perspective on something like the turnaround time, or TAT time. How much time is actually spent from the current input going all the way through the current output, the total turnaround for whatever it is that we're trying to process. Now, what does the suggested priority here mean when we say, why do we have these numbered in this way of 1 through 6? So what does it really mean? Well, basically it's a suggested priority of what could be the fastest and easiest path for finding and fixing the potential opportunities. And if you notice, it kind of snakes around in this order, and there is some intent behind that, and let me explain that. As an example, addressed first here, incoming volume. Well, these are the things, again, where we want to identify what are the things that we should be getting and what are the things that we should not be getting that may have been sent to us in error or should have been passed off to a different group. If we can identify those up front, then by attacking this first, that means whatever volume we're getting as an input is stuff that we should be working. It's ideal things that we're supposed to be working. Now that we have the ideal things that we need to be working, then at the end is when we can spend time on trying to improve the handle time for those things that we're working. So as an extreme example, I might ask, why in the world would I want to spend time trying to improve the handle time, the processing time, for items that I should have never gotten in the first place? It doesn't make sense. So if we can eliminate those items first, then we can spend our time on trying to improve the efficiency or the handle time for the items that we're supposed to be getting. Another example on here is, why is this one, the quality value added, come before readiness? Well, the reason is because when we're talking about accuracy, this number 3 example for quality value add is addressing the process steps that we own in our process that aren't adding any value. The readiness perspective is talking about things that are incomplete or inaccurate when they're handed off to us from somebody else. The reason why number 3 is associated here with the quality value added first is because this is a process step that we own. It's something that we have control. So it's probably a lot easier for us to make a change and improvement here than something from this perspective where it's still important, but because we don't own the process that created this, we don't have the control over it, it might be a lot more challenging for us to make those changes. So it's probably going to be something that's faster and easier for us by doing this number 3 item first before doing the 4th one. Again, this is merely just a suggestion for how you might flow, but overall, when you use this tool, the suggestion here is that you review this tool with a team. You talk through with your team each of these items, and as these are the folks that you would involve in your team who know the process, the subject matter experts and the process owner, all those who are very aware of the different areas of the process. And you start with one box at a time, walking through this order of identifying all the things that might fit into answering the questions within each of these boxes. As you identify each of those items, then talk through those things to understand them. And it doesn't matter necessarily whether something absolutely fits perfectly within one box or another. The objective here is to get your folks talking, get them talking about what the potential opportunities are, and then talk through the suggestion of how you might prioritize the different opportunities. Because obviously if you're talking with your team, and if they have a different suggestion of how you prioritize these, then go for that. Let your team validate and affirm the order that you would follow in trying to execute these. This suggested order is just that. It's only a suggestion. When you don't have anything else to go on, maybe you can use this to guide you. The last thing I wanted to point out on here is you'll notice that each of these boxes have different colors. The colors are associated with the type of tools or methods that you might find associated with whatever opportunities you find in a particular box. For example, in the first one here for incoming volume, what are the things that you're getting that you shouldn't be getting? Well, you might find yourself using more of the Six Sigma type of tools or methods in order to help work that. Versus this next one, workflow rhythm. That one's in yellow. So whatever items or opportunities you identify here, well, you're probably going to find yourself using maybe more lean-oriented types of tools or concepts. Versus these green boxes that are in here, These are things where you're going to use possibly some combination of either Lean or Six Sigma, something that's some blend of either one of those methodologies.
Now let's walk through an example of an IPO FAT tool as used in a project.
Alright, so here's how we might apply the IPO FAT tool in a real-world situation as an example. So let's say there is this particular back office team who's responsible for performing certain types of transactions handed off to them from some front office area, someone that might interact with the customer or whoever they're getting their information from. But basically this back office team, let's say they're failing in some of their performance goals and whatever those goals are and how they're being measured. But the team just doesn't know where they need to focus on. They don't know what the opportunities are. They're failing in so many different areas. So what you might use is something like the IPO FAT tool to help guide them to find the opportunities and build some sort of strategy for how you're going to execute these. So this strategy that you might come up with might look like this. First, identify and explore the opportunities that are out there using the IPO FAT tool, which we'll get into in just a minute. The next step would be to pilot and implement the improvements to that back office area based off of what you found. And then finally, you'd want to build some controls to measure and sustain those improvements. Now those who are familiar with Lean and Six Sigma, specifically the make methodology, might recognize what I've identified here as the second and third step. These are elements of what would be the improve and control phase, which is okay to identify these, but again, identifying these up front as part of a strategy is just a good way to communicate to the leadership of the team, especially at the sponsor level, of how you're going to execute this project. So an example of what it might look like for the IPO FAT tool and this particular situation might look like this. By talking with the team, they might identify, well, from the incoming volume perspective, here are these different types of transactions where we might find an opportunity. We might have talked through, hey, there are 3 different ones they identified. Pending adjustment approvals or some change of ownership for the customer transactions, or invalid transfers of disputes, or these are just different examples of things they might have come up with. And then from a workflow rhythm perspective, they might have found that there is some opportunities possibly with how the staffing levels are and how they're balanced with the flow of the volume of work and how that's coming in. And they might have found in some of these examples there really were no opportunities that were identified, but in other ones there were. So just by listing these different things like this and talking through it with your team is a way just to identify, here are all the potential opportunities. Let's dig in a little bit deeper, and we might find for some of these, hey, yeah, these are the ones that seem to be worthwhile. You know what, these other ones, we'll put an X on here, these are just not really worthwhile. It's good to identify it, but probably isn't going to yield much results. So let's only identify maybe these that we might have a check mark on. Just by using this approach and this kind of discussion with the team is a great way to have everyone on the same page and understanding what are the potential opportunities, and of those opportunities, which ones are the most critical and priority and how we want to attack them. So it's a great way to organize the team around that and give them a plan for how they're going to successfully execute this project.
Alright, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
Well, I'd like to challenge you to just think of a few projects that you've worked on in the past and ask yourself, was there a strategy that was developed for each of those projects? If there was, what did that strategy look like? But if there wasn't a strategy that was developed, then would it have made a difference? Would it have helped if you had a project strategy as part of that initial project? And if it would have made a difference, what kind of difference do you think it could have made? Also, I'd suggest as you review those few recent projects, consider them in light of the 6 prioritized areas of the IPO FAT tool. That is, those 6 areas that were numbered under the input and process columns. And ask yourself some of these questions, such as, were any of those 6 prioritized areas not considered as part of the project? So if they were not considered, then would it have made a difference in the results of the project if you had considered some of those areas that were missed? And also would ask, did any of the projects follow a different priority order than the suggested one that was a part of the IPO FAT tool? If they followed a different order, then again, would it have made a difference if you had followed the suggested order instead that's a part of the IPO FAT tool?
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.